Very warm welcome to everybody who has joined. I'm looking forward to this webinar where we'll be present results from the project Environmental Footprint in Swedish Industry, Increased Understanding and Implementation. My name is Maria Rydberg and I'm looking forward to being the moderator of this webinar. And when I'm not moderating webinar, I work as the director of the Swedish Life Cycle Center. And I've also been the project manager for the project Environmental Footprint in Swedish Industry. Before we move on to the updates on the environmental footprint and the results from the case studies within the projects, I will go through today's agenda, some house rules, and I will also introduce the Swedish Life Cycle Center, who is hosting the webinar. And during the webinar, I will also invite you, our audience, to interact with us through Menti at a few occasions. So this is today's agenda. The webinar is divided into two parts. One that has focused on updates regarding environmental footprint, and the other one where we will present results from two case studies that has been conducted within the project. And there will be a short break in between to fill up the coffee mug or look at something other than a screen for a few minutes. And there will be a long time for Q&A at the end, and there will be short Q&A sessions also after each presentation. So these are our main speakers for today's webinar. Björn Spak will give us an update on the environmental footprint process and on the connections to other EU legislations. Torun Hammar from RISE will present one of the case studies, and the other case study will be presented by Erika Klov and Josefin Neuwirth from IVL. And during the case study presentations, we will probably also hear directly from some of the case study industries that has taken part in the case studies. So, some information and guidelines. Please keep your microphone on mute unless you have a question at the last Q&A session in the end. We will be using the Q&A function within Zoom for the Q&A sessions that are after each presentation. So I encourage you to use this function to ask questions to our presenter, and I will be picking up the questions after each presenter has finished their presentation. And please do not use the chat for any questions that you have to the presenters. Use the Q&A function, because that is where I will look to find questions to ask during the Q&A sessions. We are recording this webinar and it will be made available on YouTube afterwards. And you will also be able to find the presentation material on the Swedish Life Cycle Center web page after today's webinar. And now it is time to open a browser window or pick up a phone, because we will start up with an easy question, but a fun one, I think, because I want to know from which country are you following this webinar. So please use the Menti code that you see on the screen and start filling in your answers. Yeah, we seem to have very strong representation from Sweden. That's expected, but very nice to see that we also have people that are joining the webinar from other parts of both Europe and the rest of the world. I'm going to give you a few more seconds to answer. Yeah, seem to have stopped at 44 responses. So I will be moving on. Thank you very much for being active and answering the Menti. We will get back to Menti later on in the webinar with a few other questions. So I will briefly introduce the project Environmental Footprint in Swedish Industry, Increased Understanding and Implementation to you, so you know what we have been doing. It is a project that is funded by Vinnova, Sweden's innovation agency. It is a one-year project that will come to an end in November this year. The aim of the project is to make businesses, authorities, and the public sector in Sweden become aware of product-related policy development based on environmental footprint at the EU level. Furthermore, another aim is to make visible and clarify the consequences of the proposed methodological choices in the environmental footprint to better understand what effect it can have in industry. And of course also contribute to further development of the methods. And besides the organizations that we saw was presented by our speakers on the previous slide, we also have had Jernkontoret, Swedish Forest Industries, Terra, SSAB, and Swedish Life Cycle Center partners that have been part of the project in different ways. And the project has, as I said, included case studies to test part of the environmental footprint methodologies to learn more and understand the effects in industries. We have also had some possibility to coordinate life cycle professionals and Swedish representation in the EU Environmental Footprint Technical Advisory Board. And we have met several times with our environmental footprint expert group that is facilitated by the Swedish Life Cycle Center, both to get input and have discussion and get updated on the environmental footprint and the latest research around it. And since we have such a large audience today, I will also briefly introduce the Swedish Life Cycle Center to you as well, since we have been managing the project. So the Swedish Life Cycle Center is a center of excellence and a collaboration platform for academia, industry and research institutes, and also government agencies. We do research, capacity building activities, all to work towards our vision, credible and applied life cycle thinking globally. The center is a partner-driven collaboration that started in 1996. And today we have 16 partners, and our network involves more than 400 life cycle professionals. But there's always room for more organizations. So if you're interested in what it means and the benefits there are in being a partner, please contact us. And we are more than happy to share and to talk more with you. I just picked up a few, three things from our calendar for some activities that are upcoming. We have a life cycle talk that is focused on biodiversity that will happen in December. And in October next year, 21st to the 23rd of October next year, we will be organizing the CTAC 26th LCA Symposium together with the CTAC organization. And if you're interested in taking part in our 2-day course in Applied Life Cycle Thinking, which is a very good course to get familiar with the life cycle thinking and how to apply it, you can register your interest on our webpage. And to be sure to not miss anything of the good stuff that we do, I also encourage you to sign up to our newsletter. That's an easy click on our webpage. And now, before we move into the environmental footprint and the case studies, we will also revisit Menti. So please open Menti again and start giving me some input, because I've introduced myself, I've introduced the main speakers and the Swedish Life Cycle Center. But what about you who have joined our webinar today? Why are you here? And so please. Well, that's nice. That's really nice that there's at least 4.3 out of 5 are looking forward to the webinar. That makes me happy. Now, I will give a very, very brief background about the environmental footprint before I let Björn Spak in to give us some updates. Although I know that a lot of you are experts in LCA, was proven on the last slide, I will still take a few minutes to talk about the environmental footprint to make sure that everybody knows the same thing. What is the environmental footprint actually? It is methods for measuring and communicating the life cycle environmental performance of products and organization, and it's been developed by the European Commission. And the methods are built on existing system for environmental communications and on international standards, such as the life cycle assessment and the ISO standards for that, ISO 14040 and ISO 14044. And the methods cover over 16 environmental impacts, including climate change, but also impacts related to water, air, resources, land use, and toxicity. And they should be able to give a comparison of the environmental performance between similar products and companies active in similar sectors. And the environmental footprint is actually kind of two methods. It's the product environmental footprint, PEF, and the organization environmental footprint, the OEF. They both calculate the environmental performance and take into consideration the environmental impact through the entire value chain, from extraction or growing of resources to the end of life of the product or of the product portfolio of an organization. To carry out the PEF for an OEF compliance study, product category and sector guidelines have been developed. They are called the PFCRs and the OFCRs. These rules include a guideline for how these rules include guidelines for development of a PEF for a product category or an OEF for a sector. It's like a recipe on how to perform a PEF or an OEF. And they could include guidelines for defining how the goal and scope of the study, what could be the relevant impact categories, what are the system boundaries, and possible data sources. And the EU environmental footprint methods were developed to put the same environmental requirements and rules for the whole European market. The methods provides a standardized way to measure and communicate the environmental impact of products and organizations, and it should help consumers and businesses to make more sustainable choices, with the overall aim to overcome unsustainable consumption and production system. It all started with the launch of the Single Market for Green Products initiative in 2013, where the methods were first introduced and a pilot phase was initiated to test the process for developing developing these product and sector specific rules, the PFCRs and the OFCRs, and also to test different approaches for verification, test communication vehicles for how to communicate life cycle environmental performance. During the pilot phase, there was over 250 leading stakeholders that were involved and more than 2,000 stakeholders that followed the process. In 2019, the pilot phase turned into a transition phase, which is still ongoing. And during this phase, the aim is to develop policy, monitor implementation, and make analysis of the market uptake of the methods, and develop more product and sector specific rules. And of course, continue with method improvements. And in the last phase, we will see policy in place where methods or part of the methods will be used in policy and legislation. And I think that's a good opening for to open up for Björn Spak, who is our next speaker, who will give us an update on the current status of the environmental footprint and its implementation and possible connections to other EU legislations. Take the floor, Björn.
Thank you very much, Maria. Yes, and thanks for this opportunity to talk and to address such a big and enthusiastic audience about these important topics. Yes, so I'll be talking a bit about the methods, the data, and the implementations of the environmental footprint into legislation. First off, I want to talk a bit about the Technical Advisory Board. So the Technical Advisory Board is the body, the expert group, the EU Commission expert group, where we together develop the environmental footprint method. I'm showing here what we have been working on in last year and what we're working on this year. So the yellow ones, and the green ones you see, that's the meetings that we are having. So we are having now 3 meetings a year, these 2 years. And in between the meetings, there is a lot of work going on. And you can see the consultations, the blue arrows on top, where we are given the opportunity to give input into the development. And the way that the Technical Advisory Board is working, if we look at the 2022, the first meeting was in April 1st. There we had the PEFCR for synthetic turf. So that is one thing that can happen at the TAB meeting. When there is a technical secretariat that is developing a PEFCR, they conduct a lot of the work by themselves. But every once in a while, they need to consult the Technical Advisory Board. So when there is a meeting, they have the chance to bring something to the table. For example, at this particular meeting, we were discussing microplastics, for example, and how to look at the reuse of synthetic turfs. So that is something that is every once in a while, a technical secretariat wants help with their PFCR. The AWG, which is says below this PFCR synthetic turf, that's the Agricultural Working Group. So that is one of the 2 working groups of the Technical Advisory Board. And they are working on 7 different milestones, 1 to 7 on different topics, manure handling and water and pesticides, etc. And typically they may report on their progress in these meetings. The same is the case with the other working group, the Data Working Group, the DWG. They have finished several of their milestones and also working with milestone B and E. But they are, of course, also very active when it comes to the environmental footprint data, the database of the environmental footprint system. The capacity building, that was about spreading knowledge about the environmental footprints and how they are working. In the second meeting there of 2022, they brought up the issue of carbon modeling. And that was something to kind of revise the way that we are looking into biogenic carbon flows. Because as of yet, although the biogenic carbon has been traced, it hasn't been indexed for any climate impact. And in order to bring the environmental footprints in line with other legislation, they opened up to reevaluate this. So they presented a paper, and that's also the consultation that you see on the top in blue on carbon modeling. The arrows are long there. The consultations don't carry on for that long time, but it's just to give an indication. We also had presentations on how to transform the environmental footprint data from 3.0 to 3.1, and reports from the AWG and the DWG. In the last meeting of 2022, we revisited the AWG. The carbon modeling was brought to a first kind of conclusion to start counting the uptake and the release of biogenic carbon. We had also some reports from the data working group, from the meetings that had been held on resource dissipation. And there we had another example of when a PEFCR technical secretariat wants to address something about the PEFCR. That was on apparel and footwear. So the work on carbon modeling has been going on into 2023. There has been consultations both on the carbon flow list. So that's basically what should it look like in the databases. And also when it comes to databases, then the environmental footprint database, it's update. It's update that is about to happen. And I think this is where we're going to conclude also in the last few meetings this year. We will touch more upon the carbon modeling. The agricultural working groups will report. And the PEFCR for marine fish for human consumption, they will address the technical advisory board. And there will also be, it's wrong, there says CFF discussions. Hopefully we're not going to have that. We had that in the last meeting. And that is one example, although the carbon modeling, that's something where the technical advisory board is willing to change the current way. But for the circular footprint formula, there is a bit of reluctancy to put more efforts into this currently, because it's felt that has been treated in such a detail over such a long time, and it has been quite resource demanding. So there are other issues that needs to be addressed. And I think what it should say, where it says CFF discussion for the last two meetings this year, it's actually about renew the way that the TAB members are appointed, or that they have their mandate, because there's currently a maximum level of 100 members. And currently there are some that are members that are not utilizing their membership, so they are not attending the meetings, while there are others that want to participate but are not given the chance because of this maximum number. I also recognize that I felt to mention the consultation that was initiated in the last meeting of 2022, on the agricultural working group milestone reports. So whereas that working group is largely working by itself independently, they every once in a while need to ask the TAB on input on what they are. As I said, there are PFCRs, the product environmental footprint category rules, and there are currently 5 new ones being developed. So for apparel and footwear, marine fish, synthetic turf, cut flowers and potted plants, and flexible packaging. And there is also an update of the pilot phase PFCRs that is going on. And what you can see to the right here, that is the flow chart on how to develop PFCRs. And I think they have all these that are being developed, they have had their first consultation. Perhaps one of them has had a second consultation also. So a bit about the implementation, but this is also about methods. And the thing is, currently there is not any legislation that says you should use the entire environmental footprints. But the subset, that is the carbon footprint, that is now being incorporated into especially 2 important legislations. So that's the battery regulation and the solar photovoltaic product regulation. So both these 2 acts, they refer to the environmental footprints and to the respective pilot phase PEFCRs. The battery regulation, which was the first one to be proposed of this, it was adopted this year on August 17th. And they have a rather intricate systems. There is over 60 delegated or implementing acts that are supposed to be developed under this. So delegated acts or implemented acts, they bring more detail than what is in the legislation by itself. So the Commission needs to develop them. And for the batteries, they have a carbon footprint declaration that will need first a separate delegated act for calculation and verification. And here there has been it has been developed. The JRC has developed this on the grounds of the environmental footprint and on the PFCR, and it is more detailed than what is in those. And some things like the electricity modeling, that could be common for all these applications, whereas there are other things that are regarding specific allocation questions on batteries that is more specific to this battery regulation application. And here we have the case where member states and other stakeholders, they are a bit concerned, especially on electricity modeling and the way it is envisaged in this document. Besides the delegated act, or should I say there are several delegated acts depending on what kind of battery it is, what kind of application. So first, let's talk about electric vehicles, because that is the first application. So first, we are now in the development of the delegated act for calculation and verification. Following that, there is on one hand, this is an implementing act for the format of the declaration. So that is not as big and troublesome as the delegated acts. But there will also be a delegated act for the carbon footprint performance levels. So perhaps a bit like the performance levels in the energy labeling. And following that, there will be delegated acts on the maximum carbon footprint threshold values. So there will be several delegated acts per battery category, and they will be rolled out over several years. And on the other hand, we have this solar photovoltaic products. So they are regulated under the current Ecodesign Directive. And there is there's a pilot phase PFCR, and it has been partially incorporated into this draft regulation. And the development here has been halted, and that is over the dispute on electricity modeling. And something that is important to take into account is that the PEF method itself and the PFCRs, they are not really legislative texts. So they can't be referred to in that sense. So if you want to use them, you either have to kind of incorporate them into a legislation, like with the solar photovoltaics, that are kind of copy pasting from the solar panel pilot phase PSCR, or develop delegated acts like they're doing in the battery regulation. And it's my strong belief that these regulations that we see here and the way that they are handled, that they will influence the development of the environmental footprints and or how it is implemented. So it can either it will influence the way that the PEF recommendation looks, or it will influence the way delegated acts and other legal texts look. Yes, here is a bit on the kind of an overview on what it looks like for the battery regulation. So on the top, you see the entry into force on August 17th. You have the declarations, when the declarations are needed for the electric vehicles, for rechargeable industry batteries, for LMT batteries, and for rechargeable industry batteries with external storage. So different kind of products, and the legislation will come into force in a consecutive way in different years. And in order for it to come into force, on the bottom side, you will see the delegated acts for the calculation and verification for these respective battery types. There are, of course, other ways to implement the environmental footprints in other frameworks and acts. The most prominent, perhaps, is the eco-design regulation, the ESPR, that was proposed last year in March. It's currently in trialogue, and it's a high priority for Spain, who is the president of the European Council. So hopefully it will be finished before there is an election for the European Parliament next spring, and which may halt this kind of legal development. In the ESPR, it's up to the Commission to develop delegated acts. They can regulate based on, for example, the use of recycled material, or the freedom from harmful chemicals, etc. But also they can regulate based on the environmental footprint or the carbon footprint. And they have been reviewing where to start, where to put the focus first. And they have started what is most like a preparatory study, which is used in the current eco-design directive. So they are doing that for textiles, and they are currently looking into it for iron and steel as an intermediary product. Also in the current eco-design directive, there is a method called the MEERP, Methodology for Eco-Design of Energy-Related Products, which is basically a screening LCA that you use to identify what kind of environmental problems are associated with this product category and how to address them. And here, the PEF, or the environmental footprint, I should say, has been integrated into the database. So they use EF data. They have broadened the impact assessment method to be identical with the EF impact assessment methods. And also that they have an end-of-life modeling, which has been adopted to the circular footprint formula. We're also looking forward to the Farm to Fork, the Framework for Sustainable Food Systems, which is a framework legislation that the Commission is about to release. They have not yet released it. Hopefully they will do it this year. And for this, they are looking into different indicators for food sustainability. And the EF-based consumption footprint, they have been suggested as indicators here. So that is another way of using the EF method than perhaps what is most often discussed in this forum. Finally, I have some other frameworks and acts that are interesting to understand the relationship to the environmental footprints. So first of all, the carbon removal certification framework, and this is kind of one of the reasons why the carbon modeling of the environmental footprint is being revised to take this into account. So I would say that the EF doesn't influence the carbon removal certification, but it's rather the other way, that the carbon removal certification will influence the way it is working in the environmental footprints. For the taxonomy, there is a weak link to the environmental footprint, so you can use them, but they are kind of they are on the same level as ISO 14044 and other frameworks. For the construction product regulation revision and including sustainability in it, they will not be referring to the environmental footprint, but to the EPD under the EN 15804 rather. So they are going a bit of a different way there. And also we have been discussing a bit about the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. That relates actually more to the ETS, the emission trading system, than to the environmental footprint. Thank you.
Thank you, Björn. Now we have time for questions, and as I said in the beginning, please use the Q&A function that you can find in the meeting window to put your questions there, and I will ask them to Björn. I will stop sharing as well for a while, so maybe I can see you. Yes, so we have a first question to you, Björn. Would you like to say a couple of words on the PEF in SSBD?
SSBD, that's the safe and sustainable by design. Actually, I have not heard very much about that recently, because it was discussed whether it should be included in the REACH revision, and it was turned down. And then it has been suggested that it might be part of the SSBD, but I have actually not heard anything about that lately. It's probably a good idea for me to revisit that to see what is going on, because I'm sorry I can't give you any more definitive answer at this moment. I'll make a note of it.
Thank you. And the second question, what milestones do you expect in terms of policy applications during next year, 2024?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that for the ESPR, probably there will be we will see like a draft delegated act or a report for a delegated act for textiles. I don't know how well it will or how well it will correlate with the PFCR for apparel and footwear, but definitely for textiles. I'm not quite sure if we will come that far with the iron and steel intermediate products. I think that's difficult to say, and I think it comes into the question of whether it will conflict with other kind of more process-related legislation. And then I think the battery regulation will continue to influence, and hopefully we will come further with the solar photovoltaics also. And then on the other hand, we shouldn't look for many new. There won't be any more new proposals from the Commission, since there will be an election.
Thank you. Let's go to the next question. You mentioned the environmental footprint database. How can you access this database? Will it be implemented in commercial LCA software, for example?
That's a good question. I mean, it has really been a struggle for a long while with the database, and that it has been difficult to access. It has been difficult to use it in other projects than very specific PEF projects. And I think the Commission, they have listened to the critique, and the current development, it's supposed to be more easily accessible and more easy to use. And I think there will be more demands on the Commission to develop more software, for example. That is, I mean, if you look to the way it's working in under the current Ecodesign Directive, there is, I mean, they have this MERP screening tool that they use themselves, and I think we might very much come into that situation where we'll have more tools that are provided that need to use that data. But exactly how it looks, I'm sorry, I really haven't been able to grasp the way it's working, unfortunately.
Thank you. We move on to the next question. Is it possible to elaborate a bit further on the relationship between CBAM and PEF? Can we expect that PEF will be accepted as a calculation method for the CBAM, for example?
Very good question. I think I need to speak to our CBAM expert on this. I would say that as a general rule, we are seeing a very different legislative environment, really, where we have a lot of legislation that might come into conflict, and where we see a need from the agency to work a lot more on this, and we are hoping for the government to give us assignments to work in a different way on these topics.
Thank you. We'll have time for 2 more questions. I know that there are more within the Q&A. Maybe Björn could write some answers afterwards, and we'll, if you have the time, and we'll see. But I will pick 2 of those that are here. What are the concerns related with the electricity modeling in the environmental footprint?
I think there are a lot of concerns, and depending on who raises them. I would say that there is a general concern on greenwashing, that people will use electricity and buy their way out of it, and not calculating with what is actually used. That, I think, is the main concern, where there are certain producers within Europe who fear competition from other parts of Europe. There are producers in Europe that are fearing competition from outside the Union, maybe China, for example, for the solar photovoltaics. And I would say that there is you can put this on a lot higher level, kind of how is how do we steer it? How do we should it reflect the electricity market? Should it steer the electricity market? So there are a bit of concerns. And one specific concern from a Swedish point of view, I can say that we are concerned that now there are these, it's the environmental footprint way, it's the solar photovoltaic way, and the battery regulation way. And we just want one way. So that is another one. Thank you. You have very good questions.
Thank you. Not that there are mine, there are the audience, but
also listening them.
yeah, very good. So last question, then we will have a short break. Following the battery legislation, are we expecting something for the complete vehicle after that?
That's a good question. So we have the ELV regulation that has been proposed now, right? The end of life vehicles. Will there be a specific one? Will it be under the eco-design regulation? Perhaps. Looking back, traditionally there are certain how should I put it? There are high European economic interests in vehicles, both from producers and from member states. And that has for sure an influence on what kind of legislation that is proposed and especially that can be adopted. And I will be happy to answer other questions that are in the chat. If I can I access them in some?
Very good. I will make sure that you can put down answers in writing, or we can pick some up at the last Q&A session as well. Because now we're gonna move into the part about the case studies. So within the project, we have been conducting 2 case studies to test part of the environmental footprint methodologies and their effects, possible effects in industry. One case study had focused on modeling the impact on climate change, which focused on biogenic carbon in an interlinked product system in long-living products. That case study was managed by IVL. SSAB participates as case industry, and that is the second case study that we will get presented here today. The first one that I will leave the floor to very soon have had focused on better understanding the consequences of implementing the circular footprint formula, which is part of the PEF framework within the automotive industry and focused on batteries. And that case study has been led by RISE, and it has included several case study industries: Volvo Cars, Höganäs, and SEVT. And now I will soon leave the floor to Torun Hammar, who has been leading the case study on carbon footprint formula with focus on materials used in batteries. And I also know that Felipe Oliveira from Volvo Car also will be presenting a few slides during this case study presentation. But Torun, please take control of the screen.
Thanks, Maria. So Maria already mentioned, but our case study is called Application of the Circular Footprint Formula within the automotive industry in Sweden. And the aim of our case study was to better understand the consequences of implementing the circular footprint formula. And this was led by RISE with 3 industry partners, so Volvo Car Corporation, Höganäs, and SEVT. In total, we were 10 people involved in this case study, where we had varying experience in life cycle assessment and also in the PEF. So the structure of our case study was that we started with a study group or a study circle, since some of us were very new to PEF as a methodology. So in this study group, we read and discussed relevant literature and documentation related to PEF and the circular footprint formula. Within this work, we also identified some challenges that we found in interpreting and how should the circular footprint formula be used. And then in particular related to the automotive industry and materials used for batteries. Including in this work, we also identify some multiple ways to interpret some things. And we developed some suggestions on how this could be clarified. Here we both discussed internally in our group, but we also consulted our extended reference group and the PEF help desk to get their input. The second part of our case study, we performed some practical testing. We both developed a simplified Excel tool where we had a simplified product example. And the reason why we did this was that since we were 10 people from different organizations using different softwares and with different experiences, we thought it was a good start. We made a simpler case that we could all test together and make sure that we understood it in the same way. Then in a second phase, Volvo Cars and Höganäs, they tested this method in their own LCA software to also see how it would work if they would actually use the circular footprint formula in their existing software. We also had a goal to evaluate the result compared to another end-of-life allocation method. This was our quite small part of the case study, but Volvo Cars did some comparisons compared to the simple cut-off method and compared it to the circular footprint formula. And a goal or part of the case study was also to evaluate the data availability and how easy it is to perform an LCA in using the circular footprint formula. And this together, we then used for evaluating what we think the overall implication of implementing the circular footprint formula in the Swedish automotive industry would be. So before we go into details on what we found in our case study, I will just give you a very brief overview of the circular footprint formula, because this is something you could talk quite long about with all the different parameters, but I will just show it to you. So the circular footprint formula allocates the environmental burden or benefits of material recycling, energy recovery, and disposal between different product life cycles. And it consists of 3 different parts. So it has a material part, an energy part, and a disposal part. So now I will show you how the formula looks. And if we start by looking at the material part, and this is what we focused on in our case study, because it was most relevant for the case that we looked at. It has one part that is connected to the input material that is used in your system. And it has another part that is connected to the output, so materials that is sent for recycling, for instance, at end of life. And the input part both considers how much primary material that is used and also how much secondary material that is used. And then also secondary materials leaving your system that could then replace primary materials and give a credit. It also has this energy part that I mentioned and a disposal part. But in our case study, it has mainly been the material part that we focused on. And as I said, I will not go into all the details in the formula because we don't have the time to do that today. But what we found as one of the main challenges when we read the documentation and the guidelines and also tried to implement the circular footprint formula was connected to how pre-consumer materials and post-consumer materials should be handled. And just to give you what the definitions we used when we talk about pre-consumer and post-consumer materials, it is that post-consumer materials, they are materials that are derived as waste streams at the product's end of life. While pre-consumer materials, they are materials derived as waste, for instance, from a manufacturing process. And we found that it was not completely clear, or it was possible to interpret this in different ways. How should these different types of waste streams being sent to recycling be handled, for instance, when it comes to calculating the recycled content, which is the R1 factor, but also the proportion of material being recycled, the R2-factored. And related to this, we also had some difficulties with interpreting how should this be handled for the quality parameters and also then the emission factors. And with that, I will leave the word to Philippe at Volvo Cars. We'll talk a bit about experience from the practical testing and also data availability.
Thank you, Torun. Hello. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Felipe, and I work at Volvo Cars. And during our practical testing at the company, we were asked to see the possibility of implementing this the CFF in our LCA software. And I can say that we were successful in doing this. It was a bit time consuming to do that because of the complexity of the formula. We needed to model the different components of the formula separately into the software. But once this was done, this will make life much easier because then it's just a matter of choosing the right data set for the material that you want to assess with the formula. So you can see this, a picture of our software there. I want to just say only that there is a small typo there in this picture because the credit part in the first picture in the upper side of the plane view there, you have the input side of the formula. And the credit there in the arrow down, it's not really a credit there, but it's credit on the outside part of the formula, which was misplaced there. But so to be a bit more didactical, we separate the formula into this into the two aspects of the formula. But it was totally possible to implement this in our LCA tool. And in the next slide, we also analyzed the data availability to perform the calculations based on the formula, and it was quite challenging. So in this matter, we did a qualitative analysis, and there's this table here, and there is more information in the report also if you want to look at it. But just to start, good availability of data represented by the green color there is when we found several data sets of background information in this LCA commercial database that we used. And these data sets were clear about what source of material was used for the LCI profile, and there was and then the production routes of the used for the calculations. And with the yellow figure, the yellow color there, which is a regular availability of data for some materials, is usually because there's only one data set available and the lack of clear information about what kind of material inputs you have on the data set or the production route used. And for poor data availability, there are no data sets available. So you see that for some secondary source of minor metals, for example, lithium, manganese, nickel, for example, they are simply not represented in the commercial databases, while plastics and aluminum, they are well represented. So one crucial point when performing these calculations is selecting the right data to comply with the aspects of the components of the formula. For example, what is the right data set for which is representative for emissions when you are substituting prime material in your process? This kind of questioning came up all the time for us, even when we were doing the exercises in order to get a better view of the formula. So it's it's quite challenging still because of data. Yes, Torun.
Thanks, Philip. So I will give you some conclusions and recommendations from our case study. And as Philip mentioned, there will be a case study report later where we will have much more details. But first, one conclusion or something we discussed is the benefit of the circular footprint formula, since it has the possibility to give incentives for both using recycled materials, but also that materials leaving your system is sent to recycling. So the circular footprint formula could be a useful tool, for instance, for internal decision making when it comes to material selection. However, we found some challenges with the documentation and the formula today. And many of these challenges were related to pre-consumer and post-consumer materials and how to handle them. So we believe that clear definitions of how different types of secondary materials should be handled is very good. And in particular, regarding pre-consumer materials, we had some difficulties, or we found multiple ways how to interpret the guidelines. We also discussed that the circular footprint formula should ideally reflect and give incentives for using post-consumer materials over pre-consumer materials, since the pre-consumer materials can be a result of inefficiencies in manufacturing processes. We also discussed that pre-consumer materials are generally considered more high value than post-consumer materials, and therefore should not give the same credit as post-consumer materials when they are replacing primary materials. And this is something that we didn't see that the formula is clearly reflecting currently. So these were some challenges that we found related to the different types of materials. When it comes to the practical feasibility, Philip already mentioned this, but data availability was something that we found as most difficult, both in performing the calculation ourselves, but also in terms of asking suppliers for their data according to the circular footprint formula, since there's a risk that different suppliers interpret the guidelines in different ways, which could lead to then non-comparable results. So until the circular footprint formula becomes mandatory, the cut-off approach would or will likely be continually used amongst the companies in the case study, and also when asked suppliers to supply data and for publicly shared LCA results. And lastly, a recommendation from our case study are to clarify guidelines on data selection, ensure compatibility with existing databases, and also provide more open access data for making PEF and also the circular footprint formula more widely acceptable. So that was a bit from our case study, and we will have more details and information in the final case study report if you're interested. So with that, I leave the word back to Maria.
Thank you, Torun. And now we have a short time for question before we open up for the next case study. And I will see in the Q&A if we have received some good questions from the audience. Yes, we have. Did you look for any guidance provided by the software providers, Sfera, Pre, etc., on how to implement the carbon footprint formula in their tools?
Maybe Volvo Card Höganäs can also jump in, but no, we did not look for that. We are aware that they are working on data sets that are EF compliant. But as Björn mentioned before, these are mostly available for official PEF pilot studies, which this was not. So we tried to find, when we looked for data, but as far as we could see, this was not available for our case study.
All right. And the second question, do you believe the definition of waste streams to be clear enough to qualify the pre-consumer scrap? This has been quite open to interpretation. For example, scraps from semi-finished production, which have almost always been redirected to the crude metal production, for example.
Well, in the documentation in PEF and the circular footprint formula, we did not find it to be clear to us when it comes to pre-consumer and post-consumer materials or scrap.
Good. Are you allowed to calculate incineration of waste without giving credit? This is in practice often the case in the real world.
So we did not focus on energy incineration, but I believe that there's a limit for the efficiency of incineration when you can count it as energy recovery, giving a benefit, and when it's not. But that was not we focused more on the material part in our case study.
Thank you. Do you see a potential in changes to the PFCRs for batteries or electric vehicles when it comes to the carbon footprint formula? If we see changes in the carbon footprint formula, will these be adopted by the PFCR?
That was a difficult question that I don't know. I mean, I know that the carbon footprint that Björn mentioned, they have calculation for batteries. They adopted the circular footprint formula, and there it has a bit different phrasing and format than in the guidelines, original guidelines. But how they will be adapting back, I cannot answer and don't know, unfortunately.
Thank you. And this will be our last question, then we will move on to our next case study. But if you have further questions, we will have the long Q&A session at the end. So if you have further questions after this one, please keep them until then. Have you dealt with some of the parameters like R1, R2, A? Did you use the default data from JRC or used your own? This is 3 questions in one, so I'm going to read them all and then you can see. Do you see a possible risk of non-comparability if you ask carbon footprint formula data questions to a supplier? So first, have you used some of the parameters R1, R2, and A?
Yes, we use the default parameters for in our calculations. We looked at different, so for the data availability, we looked at, for instance, different emission factors. So those we try to vary, and we also try to look at how could the quality parameters be varied. But it was more of a, how should I say, qualitative assessment regarding those parameters. But we based it on the default values from the start. Yes. And the second question, to remind me?
Did you use the default data from JRC or used your own data?
So we used default data for parameters, but as Philippe said, when we did this data availability check, we looked at the data that was already available for the companies and tried to see what is available there.
Yes, and the last one. Do you see a possible risk of non-comparability if you ask for carbon footprint data from a supplier?
Yes, that was one point that we discussed. Since there are risks that you interpret the formula in different ways, then of course there's a risk that if you ask your suppliers, they could also interpret it in different ways. So we see that some parts could be clarified more in the documentation and guidelines to lower this risk.
Thank you, Torun, and thank you, Felipe, for your part as well. And now we will move on to our next case study. Now we will listen to Erika Klov and Josefin Neuwirth from IVL, who will present the next case study about carbon modeling biogenic carbon in interlinked product system and long-living products. Yes, I see some responses coming in here. Close the data gaps, standard and approach harmonization. Complexity versus simplicity will be critical to a wide adaptation of LCIA. Further tests of the feasibility, assess the robustness of the environmental footprint methods for policy making, highlight problems with PEF to TAB in order to get them to resolve for better implementation. Harmonization, once again, inform and reach related actors and decision makers. Making invalid PFCRs valid again. So very nice. You can continue writing in the Menti, and I will just say thank you to everybody who has presented. Thank you everybody who has asked the great questions during the webinar. And as has been mentioned, there will be a project report that will be published on the Swedish Life Cycle Center webpage. And again, if you don't want to miss things that happens within the Swedish Life Cycle Center, sign up to our newsletter or follow us on LinkedIn.